Now, he comes back from the French and Indian War, and he marries Martha, and I will object to the way this is usually phrased, which is George Washington really made a good marriage, or he really picked the right woman, or especially he married her for her money. It always irritates me. And a couple of places that irritates me. The first and foremost is that it implies Martha was just kind of lying there in a swoon waiting to be swept up by some handsome man, and that he was so irresistible, and he looked around and he said, "I choose you," like Pokemon almost, and carries her off. But in fact, it's important to remember she made a choice as well. She was being courted at the time. She was the wealthiest widow in Virginia, 26 years old when they got married, had 4 children of her own, 2 of whom lived to adulthood. She was being courted by other wealthier men, but she chose George. And she chose George in part, and they chose each other, because they shared the same vision of what they wanted to accomplish in their lives. And fundamental to that vision was bringing their estates together, and she had by far the larger estate that she had inherited from her late husband, to bring their estates together and to build, to steward, to improve those estates, and to work together to be, in many ways, like a power couple almost, to achieve, to aspire, was very important to both of them. So she was an active partner in the management of their estates. Now, moving on, Mount Vernon is a wonderful place to visit, but it's interesting if you look at how Washington worked on building that estate in the 1760s after he married Martha. Mount Vernon, when he first comes into that inheritance, which comes from his older half-brother Lawrence, who had passed away, Mount Vernon at that time was a few thousand acres. It was focused entirely on tobacco. It was a very quiet place. If you had ridden through it, the cultivation of tobacco is very intense, but it's also basically a very peaceful activity. But it dominates everything. Tobacco is extremely wasteful to the soil, yes, but it's also incredibly labor intensive. And it takes a lot of people, enslaved people primarily, as well as free workers on the estate, but they don't have time for anything else. So you would have ridden through the estate, and you pretty much would have heard the enslaved people working, singing in the fields. You would have maybe seen them working on a barn, working to hang tobacco to dry, to gather it together, all of those things. But you wouldn't have seen or heard much more. George Washington transforms that. He decides, when he looks at what he's got here, he decides that there's trouble, potentially. And the trouble is debt. George Washington hated and feared debt more than anything else in life except perhaps Thomas Jefferson. Debt was always hovering at the window, even for the great planners. We have a tendency, when we look at this time, we look at people at Washington's level, we say, oh, the guy had it made. You know, he could just kind of sit there and he could tell people what to do and he could relax and he's got nothing to worry about. The truth is, this time in Virginia, planners were going bankrupt all the time. And the reason they went bankrupt was debt. And the reason they got into debt was largely because of the British colonial system, which thrived on credit. The way it worked, very briefly, was that an American planter would cultivate and raise tobacco, would then sell it overseas via British agents. It would be shipped overseas on British vessels, only British vessels, and those owners of those vessels would all take their cut, of course, of the profits. The agent, the British port authorities would then take their cuts when you brought it into Great Britain. The agent would take his cut, and then he would sell it himself to what he thought were the best markets, where he thought he could get the best prices. But of course, he may have many different motivations. He may just want to sell to friends of his, because he's not really too worried about what's going to happen to the planter. He has no real vested interest necessarily in what's going to happen to the planter. And it gets sold overseas. And then what comes back to the planter is not money, not cash, currency, but credit. And to be a member of the Virginia gentry at this time, as Washington was, what do you do with that credit? Yes, you buy manufactured goods from Great Britain, but you also buy the goods of conspicuous consumption. Because in order to cut a figure in society, you have to have big parties, you have to dress well, you have to have a fine carriage. There's all this pressure on how you appear. If you look at paintings of the time, including paintings of George Washington, they all seem to be fat. They all seem to have big bellies bulging out. But the truth was often that they really weren't necessarily overweight, but the painters presented them that way because they wanted them to look well-fed. It was considered to be large, to have a belly was considered to represent your prosperity, to show that you're prosperous. And so all this pressure to buy stuff ultimately ends up in debt, because you use your credit to do that. And you can never quite get enough credit, and you end up getting further and further into debt slavery, as Washington calls it. When Washington sees this, and he sees that he's falling into debt, he decides this has got to change right now. He sees many of his neighbors going bankrupt. It's got to change. He studies the problem very carefully. What can I do? I need to go into something else. He's well ahead of most of his fellow planners when he decides he's going to transfer everything into wheat. No more tobacco at all. And he does it very quickly and very dramatically. Wheat does a number of things. Wheat is much less wasteful, of course, on the soil, but it's much less labor intensive. So the people that you use to cultivate to grow the wheat, they can spend some of their time on that, but they can also spend a lot of their time on other things. It allows him to diversify because he trains them. Again, these are mostly enslaved people in his estate. He trains them to produce their own clothing, to make their own shoes, to gather and consume their own food, which is mostly fish, as well as to make their own tools. And the great thing is, he invests some money in this, and they become so productive that they produce much more than they need for themselves. And then he can not only sell the wheat, but he can also sell the tools, he can sell the clothing, he can sell the food from his fishery. He can create all of these different ventures. And then the flour that he produces, he invests in a very high-quality grist mill. The flour that he produces, he decides this is going to be famous for its quality, not just its quantity. And there's a George Washington brand flour that's sold all over the eastern seaboard of the colonies, but it's also sold in the Caribbean and is sold in other places. With wheat and the produce of that, with flour, you can sell through American merchants directly. You don't have to do it through the British. And you can look and you can find the best markets, and you can look where you're going to find the best profits, and then the money that you bring in, you can reinvest. You don't have to just use credit. Now this transforms. I was talking about how quiet Mount Vernon was when he first came into it. Mount Vernon becomes a really noisy place after he changes over to wheat, because there are all these industries going on, all these different activities going on. He buys more land and expands the estate. Now, this also has an effect, of course, on Washington's view of the British colonial relationship. And I would argue, without going into too much detail, because I want to get on to the presidency, talk a little bit about Alexander Hamilton.